Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 244, The Russo-Turkish Wars, Part 2. Last time, we covered the earliest wars between the Ottoman and Russian empires. Today, we complete the series. The next Russo-Turkish conflict, after the one that we ended with last time in 1739, wouldn't occur until the reign of Catherine the Great in 1768. This one would last a bit longer than most of them, and it wouldn't end until 1774, and it would cause a great deal of economic, political, and diplomatic defeats to the already weakening Ottoman Empire. Prior to Catherine dealing with the Turks, her predecessor before Peter III, Empress Elizabeth, was more concerned about the goings-on in Europe rather than her enemy to the south. She would involve Russia in the War of Austrian Succession of 1740-48 and the first truly global war, the 7 Years' War of 1756-1763. The Russians had initially sided with the French and Habsburgs against the British, Prussians, and Hanover, but when Elizabeth died in 1762, her successor, Peter III, switched sides. This prevented his idol, Frederick the Great of Prussia, from defeat. This would also help alienate Peter from the Russian court. He was supposedly totally uninterested in any Ottoman threat. This may be due in part to his lack of actually being Russian at all. Catherine, while also having no Russian blood in her, had wholly embraced her new nation when she took control of the government. It was the new empress's ambition to succeed where Peter the Great had failed, absorb Crimea, and gain a strong foothold on the ports of the northern coast of the Black Sea. Although the Ottomans were slowly weakening militarily, they were still a looming threat to Russia. Catherine knew this when she said, quote, "I have no way to defend my borders but to extend them." In her mind, the way to expand lay in the south with the Ottoman territory and in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west. Unfortunately, this policy of hers is still being carried out today by the Putin administration and its threats on the border of Russia and Ukraine. The conflict with the Ottomans began with a crisis of succession in Poland. Augustus III, a pro-Russian king of Poland, died in 1763. Catherine now wanted to name his successor to keep the Polish nation on her side. Unfortunately, her selection was someone who we met in the Catherine the Great Lovers series, one Stanislav August Poniatowski. This angered the Ottomans because Poniatowski would do little to prevent the first partition of Poland, which occurred in 1772, right in the middle of the latest Russo-Turkish War. The trigger for this conflict was a rebellion of a league of anti-Russian Polish noblemen against Poniatowski in 1768. They held themselves up in a fortress in the town of Bar in western Ukraine. When the loyalist Polish army, along with the Russians, took the fort, the noblemen fled to Ottoman territory. The Russians followed and skirmished with the Janissaries they encountered. A contingent of Cossacks invaded Ottoman lands and massacred the inhabitants of the town of Balta, some 150 miles southeast of Bar. This action outraged the Ottoman Sultan Mustafa III, but he decided against any military action. He was well aware that his army was no match for his adversaries. France, though, pushed the Ottoman Sultan to take up arms against Russia, primarily because they intruded into Poland. After much debate, Mustafa decided to wage war. However, this decision was against the advice of his Grand Vizier, Mehmed Pasha. Mehmed would immediately resign, replaced by a mentally unstable Silhadar Hamaz Pasha. When he was deposed, Silhadar was replaced by Mehmed Emin Pasha. Now, he had absolutely no idea what to do, whether to play defense or go on the attack. The Russians, on the other hand, knew exactly what to do. The plan was to divide the army into three. The largest, with about 80,000 men, would invade south into Moldavia, attacking the Ottoman forces there. The second, around 40,000 strong, would defend an area known as New Russia, right on the border of the Crimean Khanate. The last and smallest army would send 15,000 into the area surrounding Warsaw, Poland, to deal with the rebellion there. Naval support was hard to come by for the Russians, as they still had no fleet in Azov due to the Treaty of Nice. Instead, they had to sail from the Baltic Sea through the Mediterranean. The fighting went back and forth into 1769, when Prince Alexander Mikhailovich Golitsyn retreated from a siege of the fortress of Khotin, fearful of a potential sizable Ottoman Empire army which was nearby. As a result, he would be relieved of his command of the First Army and replaced by Peter Rumyantsev, governor of Little Russia. Rumyantsev had already shown his decisiveness in command when he secured Azov earlier in the year. Khotin would be taken on September 9th. The First Army would continue south, deciding to winter in eastern Wallachia. In Crimea, due to the lack of a Russian naval presence, the Russian Second Army could not prevent the last Crimean Tatar raid into Ukraine. As a result, the Crimeans captured 20,000 Ukrainians, selling them in their slave markets. Rumyantsev would prepare for the significant fighting in 1770, but yet again, an outbreak of the plague would strike. It was so virulent that it went all the way up to Moscow. It arrived there in 1770, late in the year, and by the time it went through into 1771, over 200,000 Muscovites died, almost half of the population. With the plague ravaging the countryside, the two sides still went into battle. The head of the Crimean Khanate, Kaplan II, led 65,000 Tatars and 15,000 Ottomans against Rumyantsev and his 38,000 Russians. The fight at the Larga River in Moldavia would see 3,000 casualties for the Crimeans, with only 90 lost on the side of the Russians. Even though they lost the battle, the Ottomans did gain vital information on the size of the Russian First Army. Rumyantsev had gained 4,000 additional troops to swell his ranks to 42,000, which was way smaller than the gathered Ottoman forces of around 150,000. The Russian general, certainly not a meek man, decided to launch a sneak attack with 17,000 infantry at 1 a.m., which is very unusual at this time in history. It was on the morning of August 1st, 1770. With other coordinated attacks, the Russians had almost reached the Ottoman camp by 8 a.m. The rout was on. The Russian artillery proved to be the winners as they pounded the underarmed Ottoman Empire's army, causing a panicked retreat. 20,000 Ottomans died, with the Russians suffering only 2,000 lost. While all this was going on, the Russian Navy, which we remember was coming from the Baltic through the Mediterranean, had finally arrived, but with 21 ships, far fewer than the 100 or so the Ottomans had. Now, the commander of the Russian fleet, someone we've talked about in the past many times, Count Alexis Orlov, was the man also rumored to have killed Peter III during Catherine's coup, would lead this naval attachment. His brilliant tactics, hatched during a war council, would end with a massive loss of 11,000 Ottoman sailors to the Russians, who only lost one ship and 660 men. The Battle of Chesma was the biggest defeat of an Ottoman naval force since the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. The Russians afterward tried to rile up the local Greek community to rebel against their Turkish oppressors. This would lead to a backlash against the Greek population in Eastern Europe and Anatolia. Thousands would die because of the lack of continued support from rebels from the Russians. On the Crimean front, Prince Vasily Dolgoruki took the fortress at Perekop in early 1771 and defeated a force of 50,000 Tatars. Within 3 weeks of this victory, all of Crimea was taken, with ports built on the Black Sea's shores. Catherine had her hard-fought victory. She now turned her eyes toward Poland. Austria, though, was concerned with the growing influence of Russia in Moldavia and Wallachia, so they made a deal with the Russians where they would take control of these two regions. But in return, the Russians, Austrians, and Prussians would split up parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia would get what is now Lithuania and Belarus. Austria received Galicia and Lodomeria, while Prussia would get East Prussia. These deals opened up negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, with a ceasefire declared on May 30th, 1772. Negotiations, though, would take about a year to begin. The Ottomans were up to their elbows in rebellions within their empire, with the most significant being in Egypt, one that was actually supported by the Russians. The ceasefire ended, though, on May 30th, 1773, and while hostilities started again, both sides were dealing with fighting on other fronts. The Russians had a real internal problem, as the famous Pugachev Rebellion would break out in 1773. It would take Russia a year and a half to squash the revolt, tying down thousands of troops who would have otherwise been used against the Turks. Even with some of their strength sapped, the war with the Ottomans was about to come to an end. General Alexander Suvorov, one of the world's most outstanding military leaders of all time, took 8,000 men, attacked an Ottoman Empire army of 40,000, and beat them soundly. Suvorov would lose 209 men, the Ottomans 3,000. The Battle of Kozludza would convince the Turks that they were on the losing side. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kanyarka was signed on July 20th, 1774, by the new Sultan, Abdul Hamid I, as his predecessor died earlier in the year, some say of a broken heart to the outcome of the war. The 1806 to 1812 Russo-Turkish War was fought against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815. Both sides feared Napoleon, but none more so than the Russians. Still, they had to commit a large portion of their army to the south to defend against the aggressions of the Ottoman Empire. They were hoping to regain the lands they lost in previous conflicts. The main battlegrounds in this war were the countries and lands of Moldavia, Wallachia, Armenia, the Caucasus, and access to the Dardanelles. The Sultan now of the Ottomans was Selim III, considered an enlightened leader who tried to continue the military reforms that began under his father, Mustafa III, and uncle Abdul Hamid I. On July 1st, 1798, the French army had invaded Egypt. This would put pressure on the Sultan to engage the Ottomans, and they would be reluctant, though, to join an alliance with Russia and Great Britain to aid them in ousting the French. The fighting on land and sea would last for 3 years, with a truce being declared in March 1801 and a peace treaty signed in June 1802. The British, having defeated the French in Egypt, decided they would keep a keen eye on the region as they did not want any one country to gain too much control. This meant that they wanted to curb the southward expansion of the Russians. In addition, the British wanted to gain ports for trade, and they feared the Russians would compete for that trade given their enormous resources. Negotiations between the Ottomans and the French continued for some time, as they both had a common enemy, the Russians. Finally, in 1805, the Turks joined Napoleon's continental system. This system sought to block the ports of entry to the British, as they were the economic powerhouse due to their embracing of the Industrial Revolution. Napoleon thought that while he couldn't match the power of the British Navy, denying them access to trade ports would weaken their economy enough that they would no longer pose a threat. On December 2nd, 1805, the French Grande Armée defeated the combined forces of the Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz. This crushing defeat led the Ottoman Selim III to see an opportunity against the Russians, so he declared war on them on December 5th. The Ottoman military had significantly been upgraded, especially their artillery division, which gave the Russians a significant advantage in the past recent conflicts. The French were instrumental in this reform effort. Selim III had tried to eliminate the old-school janissaries with a new military system, but was met with revolt. It was similar to the one Peter the Great dealt with when the Streltsy resisted change. The creation of the Nizam First Jedid, aka the New Order Army, was based on Western organization utilizing Western technology. This enraged the more traditional janissaries, and a full-scale war was possible. The year was 1806, and although Selim III had declared war on Russia, he knew there was no way he could be ready. But the Battle of Jena on October 14, 1806, changed his mind. Napoleon had crushed the Fourth Coalition, which took Prussia out of the alliance against France. Now, Russia was all alone against the French juggernaut. The Ottomans removed the Russian-friendly governors of Moldavia and Wallachia for a second time and blocked Russian access to the Dardanelles. War was declared a second time on December 24, 1806. The British unsuccessfully tried to open the Dardanelles, but the Russians were far more successful as they blew through the Turkish forces in Moldavia and Wallachia. However, the British did gain a victory with their occupation of Alexandria and Egypt. They were stopped, though, from any further progress by the Ottomans, but significant trouble was brewing within the Turkish forces. Selim III, with his victories in defense of Constantinople and the Dardanelles, thought he could push through the reforms of the military now with ease. The exact opposite happened. He sent a minister to adopt the new uniforms of the new order, but he was murdered on May 25, 1807. On the 27th, the leader of the new rebellion entered Constantinople, deposed Selim, and installed a new sultan, Selim's cousin, Mustafa IV. Napoleon no longer thought he needed to ally France with the Ottomans. He believed that with Prussia and Austria subdued, he could negotiate a peace agreement with Tsar Alexander. This would come about with the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit on July 7, 1807. After that, Russia would give up Moldavia and Wallachia and work to sign a peace treaty with the Turks. In secret, though, the French and Russia began plans to carve up the Ottoman Empire if peace could not be obtained. To further complicate matters, Almidar Mustafa Pasha, the leader of the reformers, marched on Constantinople. On June 21, 1808, he entered the city and executed the rebels who put Mustafa on the throne. Mustafa, feeling for his life, had Selim murdered. This did not do the trick, as he was captured and also executed. His younger brother, Mahmud, would become Sultan, with Almidar Mustafa Pasha named Grand Vizier. This would force reforms to the Ottoman military, although not using the term New Order. In 1809, Tsar Alexander called for a Balkans offensive. The problem was now that Russia was allied with France, they were technically at war with Great Britain. This would force the British to aid their new ally, the Ottomans. In return for protecting Constantinople and the Dardanelles Straits, the British would receive commercial trading rights. In 1810, the Russians renewed their attacks, taking Silistria in May and Béthune in August, which gave the Russians control of the Danube Delta. This was all done without the promised French help. This would cause the Russians to resume trade with the British, and this strain between the Russians and the French was beginning to take hold. Because of this, Alexander ordered that the war with the Ottomans must come to a decisive conclusion. In October of 1812, General Mikhail Kutuzov, one of the brilliant minds of his generation, led an army of 450,000 men. He began withdrawing from the area near the Grand Vizier Ahmed Pasha's troops, which led the Turks to believe they had gained a victory and crossed the Danube in pursuit. It was all a ruse as Kutuzov spun around and attacked the Ottomans. They were surrounded by the Russians, and when they realized they were out of supplies, Kutuzov ordered food to be sent to them as a peace gesture. And it worked. Ahmed Pasha surrendered on November 23, 1813. The Treaty of Bucharest was signed with favorable terms for the Turks. The Ottoman Empire survived not because of military prowess, but because of luck. The Russians knew that Napoleon was about to attack, so they were more than happy to sign up for peace. After the defeat of the French forces, though, in 1815, the Congress of Vienna was convened with the Russians, Austrians, Prussians, and Great Britain to meet to control the future of Europe. Unfortunately for them, the Ottomans were not invited to participate in the meeting. Instead, they would be further isolated by the League of States called the Holy Alliance. It was meant to cut off the Ottoman Empire and its religion, Islam, from the rest of Europe. This isolation laid the groundwork for the next Russo-Turkish War, the one that lasted 1 year and 4 months, from 1828 to 1829. What precipitated this conflict was the Greek War of Independence, which started in 1821 and lasted until 1829. The Greeks had been under Turkish control since the mid-15th century, around the time of the fall of Constantinople. While there had been several attempts to free themselves from Ottoman rule, the empire was just too strong militarily. By the early 19th century, though, the Greeks saw a golden opportunity to gain independence. They would have the aid of not only the Russians, but Great Britain and France would step in around 1827, just when the revolution looked like it would fail. In February 1821, a small Greek force led by Alexander Ypsilantis attacked and defeated an Ottoman Empire army in Moldavia after crossing the Prut River. He called for the Greeks to stand up to the Turks, as this was the time when Ypsilantis had secured support from Russia. However, this would prove to be somewhat untrue, as the Tsar at the time, Nicholas I, was all about keeping the status quo within Europe as a member of the Holy Alliance. Within the Greek community, several different factions led to a lack of a cohesive defense. Although the Ottomans were a shell of their former military self, they still posed a significant threat to the disorganized Greeks. They were further emboldened by making their Egyptian allies attack the Greeks in Cyprus and Crete. By 1826, things were looking terrible for the independence movement, as the Turks had already taken back Athens. The Holy Alliance kept the European powers out of the conflict, but a shocking event occurred that galvanized almost universal condemnation of the Ottomans. On April 22, 1827, after presiding over Easter services, Patriarch Gregory V was dragged out of the church by Ottoman troops and hanged. His body was left out in public for 2 days. This brought outrage, condemnation, and support from dignitaries like Lord Byron. As a result, the Treaty of London was signed in 1827 by Russia, France, and Great Britain, demanding that Sultan Mahmud II cease all hostilities against the Greeks. He refused. The three allies decided to send their combined fleets into the Peloponnese to pressure the Sultan. However, an incident occurred in the waters around Greece between a British ship and an Egyptian one. It would lead to the Battle of Navarino on October 20th, 1827, in which the Ottoman fleet was completely destroyed. This would lead to the independence of Greece in 1832. It was the first time that the Ottoman Empire had to acknowledge the sovereignty of a nation that once was under its rule. During the war, Mahmud had to find a way to reform not only the military, but all parts of the Ottoman Empire. He goaded the hardline Janissaries to revolt, which caused him to send in his cavalry and beat them back. The rebels were defeated, and the Janissaries were disbanded. In June 1828, the Russians sent in an army of 100,000 men into the field. The fighting went back and forth, with the Russians gaining a number of victories, followed by wins by the defending forces of the Turkish army. Still, the trend was going against the Ottomans. Finally, Tsar Nicholas I, who had been leading the Russian military to mixed results, decided to hand over control of the army to German-born Field Marshal Hans Karl von Dibschitz. He would take the city of Adrianople on August 22, 1829, which was only 200 miles from Constantinople. No Russian army had ever gotten so close to the Ottoman camp. This forced the Sultan to sue for peace. On September 14, 1829, the Treaty of Adrianople was signed. It was a crushing defeat for the Turks, as they had to make massive concessions to the Russian Empire. They gave up land and access to the Danube, Dardanelles, Moldavia, and Wallachia. In addition, the British and French forced the issue of Greek independence on a reluctant Tsar Nicholas, of all people, as they viewed it as a way of countering the growing influence that Russia had in the region. This was the beginning of tensions between the three allies of Great Britain, France, and Russia. It would lead to the next conflict between the Russians and the Ottomans. We know it as the Crimean War. As I've already done a series on the Crimean War, I'm just going to do a quick summary here instead of going into details. The French, British, and their Sardinian ally were increasingly concerned about Russia's power. Another pair of countries had been worried as well, Austria and, of course, the Ottoman Empire. Tsar Nicholas I had demanded that Russia be given the job of protecting Christians in the Holy Land, but the British rejected the notion. Finally, the Tsar issued an ultimatum to the new Sultan, Abdulmajid I. This made the French and British send in their warships to the Bosphorus. The first battle occurred on November 4, 1853. The fighting on this one would go on for around 2.5 years and would expose the Russian army as being weaker than anticipated. This was the first conflict where photographs were taken of the appalling horrors of war. The reality of the war was the casualties. It was the first real trench war, something that would be repeated in World War I. However, what was really staggering about this war was the deaths caused by disease. On the Allied side, 46,000 men died from fighting, while 120,000 died of illnesses such as cholera and diphtheria. For the Russians, it was even worse. They lost 73,000 men to the fighting and a staggering 377,000 due to disease. All in all, the Crimean War was not only disastrous for the Russians, but it was also humiliating. The Treaty of Paris was signed on March 30th, 1856. The Russians lost the territories of Moldavia and Wallachia, both becoming independent. Their Black Sea fleet was dismantled, and they were banned from any naval activity in that region. Within European politics, this war helped stimulate the creation of the German state and unify Italy. The Russians would have to wait 21 years before they could reverse any of the losses they suffered during the Crimean War. The second-to-last Russo-Turkish War would be fought over a 10-month period from 1877 to 78. Its spark would be the numerous Balkan rebellions in Albania, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria. Then the Serbo-Turkish War, Montenegrin Ottoman War, the Constantinople Conference, the expulsion of the Albanians, and attacks on Serbs during the Serbian-Ottoman War, which lasted from 1876 to 1878. Now that one would finally bring the Russians into the war. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire's armies was almost complete. Russian troops were able to penetrate the Turks' land all the way to San Stefano, only 7 miles away from Constantinople. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was forced to sue for peace. He would be the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire to have any real control of the country. Russia, while winning the war in spectacular fashion, was poised to take the capital of Constantinople when they were faced with a British naval presence. This forced the Russians to accept the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano. I can imagine Catherine the Great, who so wanted Russia to conquer Constantinople, weeping at the oh-so-near victory. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro were all granted independence. Then, after seeing the unraveling of the Ottoman Empire, the great powers of Russia, Great Britain, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Germany convened in Berlin to renegotiate the Treaty of San Stefano. The Treaty of Berlin, as part of the Congress of Berlin, was signed on July 13, 1878. While hailed initially as bringing stability to the Balkans, it would be one of the causes of World War I. None of the parties were ultimately satisfied with the results of this treaty. The Russians felt slighted, as they won the war but got few of the spoils. The countries in the Balkans felt like they should have gotten more independence. And this feeling is what eventually led to the shooting of Grand Duke Ferdinand in Belgrade, which precipitated World War I. One of the truly saddest parts of this war was the atrocities carried out by the many sides. Russian troops raped thousands of Circassian girls, forced tens of thousands of Muslims to abandon homes their families had lived in for centuries, and destroyed whole villages within the Ottoman Empire. The Turks committed their own atrocities as well. The expulsion of the Albanians was one example. Brewing hatreds of the Orthodox against the Muslims and vice versa would explode in massacres and retaliations. Some of these hostilities were over 600 years old. In hindsight, there was no question that a larger war was coming, and it would be the last conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. The mass exodus of Muslims from the newly independent regions of the Balkans and Caucasus into Ottoman territory overwhelmed the government. The costly wars and the lost territories would cause the Ottoman Empire to crumble. Their resources were drained. It was about to collapse when World War I broke out. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. They would oppose the Allied powers in a conflict that would lead to the deaths of over 10 million soldiers and countless civilians. The Russians and the Ottomans would battle in their mutual stomping grounds, the Caucasus and the Balkans. It would eventually lead to both countries collapsing within years of each other. Russia, as you know, would exit the war, see the end of the Romanov dynasty, and plunge itself into the Russian Civil War. Then it would reemerge as the Soviet Union, which would last until 1991. The Ottoman Empire would cease to exist after 1922, becoming the country of Turkey. Its long history, beginning in 1299, would come into conflict with its northern neighbor Russia for centuries, as you've seen. So it is fitting that each would collapse around the same time. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we go in a completely different direction, when we talk about the ill-fated lives of the son and daughters of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.